Good afternoon readers, it's Tilly here from Tilly's Shelf. And I feel like I should kind of apologise for the deluge of videos this week. I think it's because I'm on holiday, but this is going to be my fourth. I'm back at work tonight on night shift, so I won't be recording anything more probably for a little while. So normal service or lack of service will be resumed with one video a week on every Wednesday. I think next week it will be a video of me packing up my bookshelves for when we were moving house, so that's from a little while ago now. So today I'm going to be cheating and I'm going to be talking to you about something that I haven't read, which is The Tragedy of King Lear by William Shakespeare. I am using notes today to organise my thoughts, so I'm going to be using my dull, boring, teachery note reading voice, just to warn you. We're still in September, so it's still kind of ShakeTube. I'll try and put a list of the hosts for ShakeTube up there if I can. So I like to think that this is kind of topical, even though none of them chose King Lear as a play to read, which I was a little bit disappointed about, but there's always next year. So the other thing to say before we get really stuck in is that this play came out in 1606, so if you don't know what went on in it, you are a little bit behind the times, and I'm going to talk about all of the plot twists and all of the characters as though you know about them, so just so long as you're aware of that. So even though I haven't read it, I think this is definitely one of my favourite Shakespeare plays. It might even be my favourite. I'm a bit indecisive about favourites normally. And I think it's probably one of the plays that I know best, simply because it's one of the plays that I've seen the most. And I think with Shakespeare, kind of knowing it matters a lot to how much you like it. And that's really what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about having seen the play, because last night I saw it again. I didn't see it in the theatre, I saw it via National Theatre Live, who record and broadcast performances live to cinemas across the UK. And I believe they also save those recordings and do international encores in cinemas around the world. So you may get the opportunity to see this, keep your eyes peeled, it may come to a cinema near you, and if it does, I highly, highly recommend it. This is the second performance that myself and Beau have seen with National Theatre Live, the other one being The Tempest with Simon Russell Beale, and both times it was just amazing to have the opportunity to see these plays performed by some of the best actors of our time without having to travel miles and miles to see them. It's just brilliant. So down to the actual production that we saw yesterday, which was the 27th of September. I don't know whether I'll get this all edited today before I have to go into work, we'll see. So this production was a Chichester Festival Theatre's production originally, I believe, and it has now transferred to the Duke of York's in the West End. And those are two very tiny, intimate theatre spaces, so this was a very intimate production of King Lear. I think the cast was around about 20 people, so it wasn't like it wasn't like the tiniest cast that you probably could have done it with, but it was quite a small arrangement. It starred Sir Ian McKellen, and if you don't know who Sir Ian McKellen is, he is this guy. He is a wonderful Shakespearean actor, but outside of the world of Shakespeare, he's probably best known for being Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings. I will try to put a link to the trailer for this version either at the end of the video or down in the description so that you can check out the trailer and get an idea of what the production setup was like. This is actually the second time that I've seen Sir Ian McKellen as King Lear, and both times he really blew me away. The other production was on a much larger scale. I think it might have actually been at the National Theatre, and it was a really big production with all of the effects. There were a lot of good effects in this production, but obviously with a smaller stage there was less that they could do. And both times, like I said, he was fantastic. He is such a good fit for the role, and he really doesn't take himself too seriously. And this performance as a whole didn't take itself too seriously. It had some definite irreverent moments, and it's just great to see an actor of this calibre just running around the stage, waving a bouquet of flowers around with a tie tied around his head, and a really like tragicomedic approach to the play. And I think that is really needed sometimes to counterbalance the serious speeches that he really pulled off well, of course, and like the levity counterbalances the more tragic, truly tragic moments of the play. Other really standout performances, other than Sir Ian McKellen himself, was Sinead Cusack as Kent. They made the very interesting decision to cast Kent as a woman, and I really think that's the kind of liberty that stage directors should be taking with Shakespeare, because it worked so well and it added a whole new dynamic to Kent's relationship with Lear, and it also enabled them to use this really great female actor in a very important role, and she shone through. And then later, when Kent goes into disguise as Caius, she dressed up as a man in the great tradition of Shakespearean actors cross-dressing. And she used this really full Irish accent, which was just a luxury to listen to. Kirsty Bushell as Regan was amazing as well. I wasn't entirely sure about the very sexualized portrayal of Regan, which I might come back to, but as the story went on, it really worked for me by the end of the play. The whole of the Gloucester family was really good. So Danny Webb as Gloucester, particularly in the later scenes, was excellent. James Corrigan as Edmund, who was played in this version as a purely malicious and manipulative character, and it was good to kind of see that level of evil being played. It's just fun to see somebody acting really bad. But most especially Luke Thompson as Edgar. There was this moment when he was transforming himself from Edgar into poor Tom, and it wasn't just like an assumed disguise, but a pure emotional transformation, and I loved it. So I thought that he did really, really well in that role. I also loved Anita-Joy Uwajeh as Cordelia. I love the role of Cordelia in itself as like a self-possessed female character in Shakespeare. Always good to actually get one of those. But I loved this actress in the role and the way that she portrayed her affection for her father at the end. She was in tears, which I'm sure is an actor's trick, but I was very nearly in tears as well. Also, Beau and I were talking on the way home about the choice of casting the two older sisters as white actresses and the younger sister as a black actress. And it not only brings in a kind of racial dimension to the power gap between them, it also calls up the idea of Lear having multiple wives potentially, and with him loving his youngest child best. For me, it really called to mind that other major patriarch with a favourite child, which is Jacob from the Old Testament, where because he loves his last wife most, he loves his youngest son the most, and that leads to jealousy and murderous intent between the siblings, and in the end his kingdom is brought to its knees by famine in Jacob's case and war in King Lear's. So the moral of the story to all you parents out there watching this is don't have favourite children, and your world will not be destroyed. Perfect. So I think that's enough raving about this specific production. I'm obviously going to keep talking about it as I go on. And if you've happened to have seen that, or if you've seen any other renditions of King Lear that you particularly enjoyed, that is what the comment section is for. Do please talk to me about them. I wanted to go on now to talk a little bit about the play and the themes within the play, as somebody who has never studied it but has just watched it and enjoyed it. So as we were standing up to leave the cinema, I overheard somebody close to us saying something along the lines of the play just being about an old man running it around the stage. And somebody in the row ahead turned around, I don't know whether they were of the same party at all, but she turned around and she said, well, that's kind of the point, isn't it? By the end of the play, he is just an old man. And to use that small exchange as a bit of a starting point, at the beginning of the play, Lear is a loved and respected independent king, but he divests himself of the responsibilities of royalty, and bit by bit from then on he descends into a state of dependence. His followers are largely either killed, or they desert him, or they're also banned by his daughters. And it gets to the point that he is completely alone, and even when those come along who would recognise him as king, he is barely able to recognise himself and those loyal to him and those close to him. Like Edgar, Lear's transformation is almost complete. He almost fully loses who he was before, but unlike Edgar, there is no real element of choice in that, even though those around him try to say that there is. I'm thinking of Goneril and Regan here. They sort of accuse him of being stubborn and cantankerous, or even simply foolish, to absolve themselves of the necessity of caring for him, which is very much familiar to me in terms of the way that people do treat their aging relatives. There is this exceptional scene in Act 4, Scene 6, when Lear has been rescued by Cordelia and given the rest that they think he needs to be restored, and in this production they had him waking up in a hospital bed, in hospital pyjamas, and they even got the detail, which you might not understand unless you've seen old men in hospital, of his hair, which was all combed down flat to one side, and it really changed the way that he looked, and with it he lost so much of his character, and he became so dehumanized, as old men are dehumanized in hospitals. And he has this speech: I am mightily abused. I should e'en die with pity to see another thus. I know not what to say. That moment was so meaningful to me, and I felt that it was a very deliberate comment on how we treat old men, and especially confused old men when we do care for them, with such condescension, with such a reduction of their personhood. And that was very topical to me, and I thought Sir Ian McKellen used his age very effectively to show the vulnerability there and to condemn that way of acting towards older people. Talking about personhood and character and also recognising yourself and others, this play has got a lot in it about character and perception of character and disguise and duplicity. I remember when I first watched it being very incredulous about how many people assume a disguise and are not recognised, and thinking, how can a father not recognise his own son? How can a man not recognise one of his oldest friends? It just didn't quite make sense to me. Now, we all know that Shakespeare loved his disguises. I'd imagine it was very popular with audiences, and it's wonderful, like I said about Luke Thompson, to watch an actor assume a new character in front of you on the stage. It really shows their skill and their craft. But a certain amount of suspension of disbelief is always necessary, to be sure. But I think actually the multiple disguises shine a light on one of the deeper questions in the play, which is, to what extent can we ever truly know one another? Which links into other themes of treachery and love and relationships. As is usual in Shakespeare, the subplot really throws this into relief, with Gloucester putting his trust in the wrong child because he doesn't know his children, he doesn't see them accurately. So he puts his trust into Edmund, who is really out for his own advancement, which directly mirrors what happens to Lear with trusting Goneril and Regan. So in terms of characters who are perceived inaccurately, we get Edmund, the bastard son of Gloucester, quite literally running rings around everyone with his vindictive campaign, and yet everyone believes he's on their side. We get Gloucester led for miles by his own son, lamenting the loss of that son, even as he clings to him. But really this theme centres around Lear and whether people know him and whether he knows the people around him. So we get Kent knowing King Lear for years and still being completely taken by surprise by his actions in scene 1 when he disowns Cordelia. We get Lear not knowing his daughter's characters and putting his faith in the two who cannot be trusted with dire consequences. And in Kent's anger at this, it almost seems like he wants Lear to suffer his comeuppance from that, when he or she in this production says, "See better, Lear," which was played in this as quite an angry line, as kind of wanting him to have his eyes opened even in a painful way to this. The culmination of this to me is at the end, when Lear finally does start to see, and he sees Cordelia and he recognises her, but he is so far gone that he even doubts that. And he says, "Do not laugh at me, for as I am a man, I think this lady to be my child." To back up these themes of recognition, the play is peppered with references to sight and seeing and eyes, not least in the dreadful scene in which Gloucester's eyes are picked out, which always has me on the edge of my seat, biting my fingernails, and generally just very, very, very intensely uncomfortable. It's genuinely always like a scene from a horror movie, and I don't like horror movies. I can't pick out many because obviously, like I said, I haven't read this or studied this, and I've already mentioned the line "see better," but from a quick skim through, I've got Lear in Act 1, Scene 4. "Old fond eyes beweep this cause again, I'll pluck ye out," which is obviously a direct reference to what happens later to Gloucester. Actually, a lot of the lines that I have found are from Lear, which I guess underlines that parallel. There's also, again in Act 1, Scene 1, Lear says of Cordelia, "For we have no such daughter, nor shall ever see that face of hers again," which reflects back on that later scene that I've mentioned when he does see her again. To which Cordelia directly responds, "With washed eyes, Cordelia leaves you." So again, another reference to eyes, and often associated with water and tears as well. So the emotion associated with the eyes there. Lear also tries to understand people's characters through their eyes, for instance saying to Regan of Goneril in Act 2, Scene 4, "Her eyes are fierce, but thine do comfort and not burn." My reading of all of this is really that the eye symbolism goes along with the idea of the eye as the window to the soul. I don't know where that phrase originally came from, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was Shakespearean in itself. It sounds a little bit Shakespearean. And calling that into question very deliberately and saying that, you know, even if we do look deeply into another person's eyes, we can't understand them really. We can never really get into that soul. And just generally, like I said, questioning human relationships and our ability to relate to one another and understand one another, whether that's between friends, between siblings, between parents and children, and between states, between the different players in the war that takes place towards the end. And concluding very pessimistically that we don't know one another. We can't see one another accurately at all. So my most recent other experience with King Lear was through a book that was a modernisation of it set in contemporary India, or nearly contemporary India, called We That Are Young by Preti Taneja. I did a whole review video of that as well, where I talked about why it didn't quite work for me. It was actually the second video that I ever did on BookTube. I will link it at the end if you're interested. And because that was my most recent other experience of Lear, I was reflecting on that as I was watching this, and reflecting on the portrayals of the characters in particular. In fairness to Taneja, I have to say that I'd forgotten quite how important kind of sexual tension is to some of the drama in the plot, and how important it is for Goneril and Regan to come across as people who have sexual desires. And I like the way, on reflection, that she built whole scenes into her book out of things that are really just passing mentions in the play. Like Lear curses Goneril and says that she will be barren, and Taneja really adds that fertility dimension in between the sisters as another point of sort of tension between them. But I think otherwise my view on that still stands, in that it wasn't a very good book for me. So I'm going to wrap that up there. As you may be able to tell, I find this play absolutely fascinating, and if you do too, and if you've got other thoughts about themes that come up in it, or other ideas about how those themes are developed, or anything that I've said has sparked any thoughts for you, be sure to let me know in the comment section, because I would love to discuss it. So thank you very much for watching. As usual, happy reading, and I will speak to you soon. Bye!